Again, my name is Michael Gordon. I'm with CRH, big name, right? Marketing business solutions partner. So again, CRH is really I make fun of it. It's like the largest unknown manufacturer in the world. So CRH is a sister company of Ash Grove Cement here in the Pacific Northwest. And under our materials side, Icon Materials up here in Seattle. It is Riverbend Materials out in Portland. My counterpart, Michelle, was just up here, Jackson, part of the Old Castle IPG, which is inclusive of our pipe, precast, stormwater, and enclosures. And then lastly is our APG division, which is a lot of brand recognitions like Belgard, Sackcrete, Brett Fencing, Pebble Tech, and then I did forget about the low man in the group. There's Leviat. There's most of our lifting and bracing for our cement, concrete tilt panels, and kind of sled jab anchors and accessories around those applications. So wanted to thank the panel for coming today. Take a quick second to just let them introduce themselves. If you want to just introduce your name, your company and role, and, just something lighthearted. You're on the verge of the election, like who you'd vote for and why. So just joking, contest in the crowd, just having fun today. No, but on a light note, just maybe something about like what you like most about your job. So go ahead and open it up.
Nice. Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Waters, and I serve as Sustainable Procurement Program Manager with the City of Portland, Oregon. And I've been in this role for just over a year, but prior to that, I worked with the Portland Bureau of Transportation, first as Contract Equity Coordinator, then as Contract Supervisor, and prior to that, so I myself am a member of the Tlingit tribe, Dog Salmon Clan, so I was so excited to see that Chum Salmon run. Those are my people. But I grew up in the Portland urban Indian community and spent a lot of my time in climate justice movement building before I started in the procurement realm within the city of Portland. So this role brings all of those elements together, and I'm so grateful.
Thank you. I'm Ryan Kruger. I'm a Senior Capital Project Manager for Washington County, Oregon. I've been in that role for about 3 years now, really looking at sustainability in that project design realm and trying to incorporate some of those ideas into our whole design and construction process. Before my role, Washington County, I'm a plan engineer, so I've worked in hazard mitigation planning, worked in resiliency planning in a number of different jurisdictions across the West. And so kind of covering a lot of ground with our presentation today. We'll probably touch on some of that as well as some low sustainability and low carbon procurement strategies as well. And I think that's kind of what my job now, I think I really appreciate all those different touch points, being able to think about those ideas from the conception of a project all the way on through to construction. It's pretty fun.
Hi, I'm Andrew Curry. I work for the Government Accountability Office, and I'm an assistant director there. So I work a little differently than everyone here. I work for the U.S. Congress, nonpartisan, fact-based information gathering, sharing, collection. So one exciting thing today that I'm excited to talk about is our disaster resilience framework. And part of what we do is go out and speak to people like all of you, as well as all of the federal partners, and identify the best practices for addressing things like climate change and reducing the federal fiscal exposure to natural disasters. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our principles of that framework today in the context of this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Janice Zahn. I'm the chief engineer for the Port of Seattle. I'm also a council member in Bellevue, Washington, so actually in both those hats. In my day job at the port, we oversee SeaTac Airport, cruise terminal, container terminal, buildings, fishing terminal, recreational boating. So quite a bit of infrastructure. We're over 100 years old, and because we're right on the water, resilience is a really big thing. And I would say that one thing, it's a really exciting time right now because we have such aging infrastructure. We don't have enough money. Actually, I don't know why I'm calling it interesting. Maybe it's quite a challenge, but I think maybe we all lean into challenges. And right now, there's a lot that needs to be done. And the longer we wait, the more money we're going to have to spend to work on the aging infrastructure and resilience.
Perfect. Appreciate that. Again, our topic today is adapting infrastructure for the changing climate, and appreciate the panel and all the market experts up here, kind of opening up our discussion, kind of around the current challenges and our risk assessment. Like, what are the most pressing climate-related challenges, and how do public agencies conduct climate risk assessment, and what key factors do they or are you considering in evaluating these vulnerabilities? Go ahead, anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So from my vantage point, so I'm housed within Central Procurement Services at the City of Portland. So all of our procurements and solicitations and all of those activities comes through our group from the different bureaus. So there's more that I could share about outside of that scope, but within that framing, one of the greatest challenges is to ensure that our construction projects and the associated materials are not contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions and toxics reduction and toxics exposure in the same way that they have in the past. So we've been exploring different ways to reduce our impact through our low carbon concrete program, for example, and other initiatives to try to reduce that exposure to greenhouse gases and toxics. I'll also just mention, because it's a personal passion of mine, that it's really important to make sure that we're bringing along those living on the front lines of climate change and building that workforce capacity for this new economy that we're building.
I would say, building off of what Carrie said there, and my current lens as a project manager, we think about building projects that are going to last a long time. So we're thinking about impacts of climate change, whether that's increased flood risks, increased exposure to changing climatic conditions, whether it's really more extreme heat, more extreme cold, longer durations of those. But that also impacts how we're actually building those projects in the summertime. If we're inundated by smoke, we have more days where we have to be concerned about air quality impacts for our construction crews that are out there, for our inspectors, inspection supervisors. So we've already got a tall task in front of us to have an infrastructure to make sure we're correcting some of those mistakes we've got in our infrastructure, bringing that infrastructure back up to the standard that we want it to for the long term, and just maintaining that system. If we have fewer days where we're able to be out there in the field doing that work, that's going to hamstring us in those efforts as well. So while we're trying to incorporate more sustainability into the ideas that we are approaching our projects design and construction with, whether it's low carbon materials or using less or whatever it might be, we also have real world implications from our changing climatic conditions that are also going to impact our thought process there.
And I would just add that using credible and authoritative information is a key part of this. There's a lot of information out there. What information you are using to make decisions is incredibly important. And what information are you sharing with partners in the industry who are also going to make a difference using that information?
Yeah, and I would add that being a port authority right on the water, sea level rise is one of our largest challenges. Is that, we design structures that last, 50, 100 years. So what design standards do we want to adopt? And we're actually in the middle of developing some environmental standards, updating our standards and specs for what do we want to see for the future, thinking about this from the standpoint of sustainability and resiliency. But the other thing we have to balance is what can we actually afford, right? So we have so many facilities, aging infrastructure, and how do we make sure that we're taking care of business? The other thing with port authorities is that we do a lot of work through our leases and our tenants. So when we think about resiliency, we're doing a lot around shore power. So by 2027, we're requiring any of our home ported cruise ships to be able to plug in when they're on shore. We actually have 2 of our container terminals where when they're at berth, they're plugging in. But, that's one piece of it. And then at the airport, we're trying to work on sustainable aviation fuel, and trying to have 10% of our mix to be sustainable by 2028. And that's a tall order too, because we don't actually generate any fuels ourselves. So actually working in partnership to drive that type of innovation and change.
Good.
And to speak to your question around risk assessments, I just also wanted to mention that, our sustainable procurement program at the City of Portland has been around since 2003. And we started within the realm of recycled products for our office supplies, for example, and paper. But in 2016, we commissioned a sustainable supply chain analysis. And that showed to us that we have 4 times greater of environmental impacts from our supply chain as compared to our operations. And the majority of these impacts stem from our construction activities and equipment usage within the city of Portland. So that helped to guide our direction in subsequent years to focus more on embodied carbon, sustainable wood sourcing, our cleaner construction program, and other initiatives to address construction and equipment specifically.
Yeah, staying on that sustainable topic and green infrastructure, like discussing maybe some specific examples of sustainable green or low carbon infrastructure initiatives like that have been successfully maybe implemented within the region. Maybe we can kind of touch upon that.
Yeah, so we launched our low carbon concrete initiative with the bare minimum to start, just asking for those disclosures through environmental product declarations around any concrete mix that was used on projects that were subject to these requirements. So we started with a 50 cubic yard threshold for our construction contracts. And the global warming potential threshold that was set was based on regional averages. And we did all of this in collaboration with our internal and external stakeholders, with our concrete mixers and suppliers. And we're at the point right now where we're evaluating where we've been thus far. We've heard really great feedback from nearly everyone. Of course, there are those different perceptions that folks have around the performance. Will this perform at the same level as conventional concrete? And we found that yes, it indeed does. Set times can be longer, but there are different admixtures that you can incorporate into the mix to speed up those set times. And, you know, if there's ever a perceived setback or challenge associated with the mixtures, we have found for the most part that, you know, we can bust those myths. Sometimes there are increased costs with some of the supplementary cementitious materials, if I'm recalling the term correctly, that we add to the cement to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And those can include slag and fly ash, which are byproducts of coal and steel production. And so as we're seeing, you know, cleaner production methods and less use of coal, for example, we're finding, I've heard that those products can be more scarce. And so we're trying to shift into what our desired future state is. These are really great solutions for the interim. But what is our desired future state? There's lots of emerging technologies out there.
I can't say enough about what City of Portland is doing in this realm. And as an agency that's adjacent to them in proximity, we really rely on their expertise to sort of build our own framework for trying to approach low carbon material in design. Andrew said it earlier, data is a really big important of this process. So whether it's the NRMCA data where you're thinking about regional averages for your global warming potential for your different mixed strength classes, there's going to be more granular data that they're working on right now to have those estimates reflect a little bit more specificity to the regions that they're ultimately intended to serve. We're also looking at the EPDs, the environmental product declarations, working with the suppliers to make sure that they're providing EPDs that are up to date. If you go search for an EPD on the internet, you could probably find several for the same mix design. You have to look at the dates on them. You got to understand more what those materials are kind of included in there. So it can be a process. And so agencies like ours are really relying on individual champions or sort of an individual approach and are trying to have it be more incorporated into our standard process. We're writing a spec for low carbon concrete use, for example. But every agency can approach this question in a different way. You know, Carrie mentioned that starting with thinking about some of the small steps they might take in recycling and then how that's kind of blossomed into the work that they've done in this realm. I think that that's what our agency is really trying to take up is what can we do at a scale that really supports us now? How can we start to change hearts and minds and start to have it be adopted more widely, but ultimately make that information really available to the whole of our capital projects division and ultimately our agency. So if somebody from planning, for example, is working on an update to a bus stop project, they don't have to go out and reinvent the wheel. They can come and get a spec for low carbon use and thinking about incorporating it into their project, learn from those lessons. We've serendipitously done several projects with low carbon concrete. Now looking back and saying, okay, what projects have we done over the last few years that have actually met that standard? How have they performed? Demystifying some of that stuff for our ops and maintenance folks so that they know that they're not going to have to go out there and replace those ramps time and again because it's something different than they're used to. It all becomes part of this complex puzzle as we fit together sustainability. And then we haven't even really talked about the new technologies that might be out there, carbonation. There's some precast stuff that New Zealand just did a precast raised ped ramp. And precast structures, you can get some more efficiencies in your global warming potential savings there as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach this question. It really becomes agency specific, but starting from somewhere is really what you have to do.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, we're really looking at all aspects and we're piloting different things. So our Sea Concourse expansion project is the one that we're using sustainability framework, understanding embodied carbon. And then we're actually renovating this built wood structure over 100 years old at Fisherman's Terminal, and it will be a living building challenge project. So a lot of what we're trying to really understand is we have so many different business lines and the sponsors have some different ideas about what they want to do, and just staying nimble to what they may be ready for, and then staying grounded in, we've had construction waste management and diversion for a long time. And for the North Satellite, if you flew out through that structure, through that building, that is the one that we actually created. We collected rainwater for flushing toilets. And that's the first one at the airport that we've done. So it's just really looking at all the different ways that we can think about our built environment differently.
Perfect. Appreciate that. I talked about a little bit about the collaboration side. Like, do you see any opportunities for federal and state agencies to work together? Like, and are these successful partnerships? I mean, are there any successful partnerships that you guys know of that you can highlight?
I can speak a little bit to that. In terms of this integrated planning, one of the things we have identified is, in particular, DoD at its installations does actually coordinate with the local communities, and they have grants available to local communities to incorporate some of these practices into their effort. So at the federal and state level, and then again at the local level, there are areas where collaboration can take place, and you can change some of your local incentives by collaborating with those federal partners. Locally, we have the Army Corps of Engineers down here on the Duwamish. You have a lot of Coast Guard in this area, and since I tend to work on the Coast Guard, you probably all know they're just down the street. So can you collaborate with them when they're embarking on a capital project and incorporate some of these practices into it? Yes, our work has shown that those opportunities do exist. And that federal collaboration with the state and locals is incredibly important to me personally, because this is also how we get some of the information to help advance the narrative nationally. You collaborating with partners at the federal, state, and local level, when we come knocking and ask for your input, this becomes really important to the dialogue.
I was going to say, we rely heavily on both state and federal grants, as well as working with our partners. So from the cruise side, the Green Corridor, we also have our Northwest Ports Clean Air Strategies. And so that is really, the more we hold hands with both actually public agencies as well as our private partners, we know that we can't do it alone, just because if you think about just the amount of logistics and trucks that come through our container terminals, decarbonizing the large vehicles is going to take a lot of funding.
Well, I was just going to say one other partnership in addition to some that have identified, private partnerships working with, we've got a consultant group that we're working with on our low carbon concrete standard, meeting with the concrete suppliers. I think public-private partnerships, as well as thinking about, the NGOs, nonprofits, tribal groups. There's a lot of folks we need to, as far as collaboration goes, we need to be bringing everybody in that we can.
Yeah, that's like the community engagement, right? Like how important is it to get to get those other entities kind of involved as well, right? Outside of the federal and state.
Outside of federal and state partnerships, I also just wanted to highlight the importance of those collaborations at the local and regional level. And I'll start by sharing about the Clean Air Construction Collaborative. So, as I mentioned, we had that sustainable supply chain analysis, and we found the greatest impacts coming from construction and associated equipment. So we convened the Clean Air Construction Regional Collaborative with Washington County, Multnomah County, a handful of other public agencies, and we all agreed that we would hold our contractors to the same standards. We all have the flexibility of identifying the threshold at which those standards kick in, but we have the same compliance platform where all of our different contractors enter their equipment and verify that it is in compliance with our standards. And we set up a tiered system in accordance with EPA standards to reduce diesel particulate matter emissions on our projects.
We're actually having someone come out and speak to us about that next month. So very exciting stuff.
So excited to hear.
So on that front, let's talk about the flip side of it, like lessons learned, right? Like what lessons have been learned from past projects that can form future infrastructure adaptations? Like, are there any common pitfalls that we've kind of come across that we've learned from that we want to discuss or kind of talk through?
It costs a whole lot more to clean up than to plan ahead. Our work has found that a dollar spent on planning and preempting a disaster saves about $13 over the long run. We are in the process of paying off the interest on more than $2 trillion worth of disaster-related appropriations for the cleanup process. So planning ahead and incorporating this ahead is a hard sell, but there are incentives. There are ways to do it at the federal level, and there are also disincentives that folks in the regulatory and government world can reduce administratively.
Some of the lessons we've learned, is sort of mirrors a conversation I'm having with another metro governmental agency in Portland. They're looking at applying low carbon concrete to more of their projects, and some of the questions that are coming up are about long-term longevity, maintenance, operations. And so it's demystifying some of that stuff. It's looking at pilot projects, finding ways to incorporate those things into different lenses, and ultimately and bringing folks to that information. Tours of your projects that have been completed are a good way to do that. But thinking about it even just in a dollars and cents mindset too. I know you made a presentation that I was at not long ago talking about the cost of low carbon concrete, for example. And we've seen it's like a 0 to 5% cost increase across most of our projects. And so when you look at the dollars and cents there associated with it, we're not just making decisions with hearts and goals that are a little bit higher minded. We're really looking at it in a financial efficiency level too, and making the most of those tax dollars that we've got to be able to spend on fewer and fewer projects as things cost more and more and more. So I think that trying to take some of that, some of the questions out of it. I was mentioning earlier to another member of the audience, I was talking about this. We have consultants that we work with. So few of them have used low carbon concrete, even, for example, even working in the Portland metro area. And so it's talking about it on a whole host of different levels early in the design process. So you're not bringing this up at the 11th hour and then trying to do that education process while you're going out to bid or getting your contract or construction documents all ready to go. You've actually got some of those pieces folded in earlier on, and then you can adopt higher level strategies potentially based on having some of that information incorporated earlier on. Right.
Yeah, I will just double down on that. I think the biggest thing we've heard is that we have to have the discussion as early as possible, because if you have that conversation later in the process, no one wants to talk about it, and because you've already locked in your scope, schedule, budget. And also that if we're going to look at that total cost of ownership and sustainability, we might need to think about a separate bucket of adders so that the people delivering the project doesn't feel like they are themselves carrying the cost of these changes that we're making that may have an initial higher cost, but from a total cost of ownership standpoint, it makes more sense. but it's one group that sometimes is having those discussions around the first cost, and somebody else that's talking about the operation and maintenance and total cost of ownership.
So then looking in a lens of kind of future innovations, so what emerging technologies or innovations do you see shaping the future of climate resilient infrastructure? As we kind of talk about these changes and what we're, these new products and whatnot with the low carbon concretes and whatnot. If you want to kind of speak upon that.
Yeah, I was grateful for the opportunity to attend a low carbon concrete celebration last week, where we learned about emerging technologies, and we even got a dramatic reenactment of the signing of the original Portland cement patent. So that was amazing. But I was really grateful to learn about some emerging technologies like the development of biochar that happens as a byproduct of biofuel production. And, as we think about these interim solutions that I had mentioned, like the use of slag and fly ash, I've just been hearing from folks that those costs are going up and that those materials are becoming more scarce. So we have to think about what the future looks like, whether that is use of biochar as, a supplementary cementitious material to use in our low carbon concrete. Or, I've even heard about, I think, like hydrogen injection, nanoparticles. I don't know all of the details, but I'm learning myself, and I'm really excited to, assess all of these different options that are emerging over time so we can figure out what that desired future state looks like for us.
There's no shortage of new technologies. I'm excited. I have to pick your brain about that event in Portland because I wanted to go to that. Some of the ideas that you talked about there, it's kind of building on some of those. Glass pozzolan is another binder that we've seen some discussion on. We live in a volcanic region, so you can think about some other types of rocks, and ultimately those are other things. Volcanic materials may be used as a binder as well. But I mentioned, and you talked about the clean air construction standards, Carrie. One of the other things that we're thinking about is how can we build things more efficiently, quicker. I mentioned that we're seeing precast, ramps, precast structures of all types that are being used in transportation projects. If we can get those things installed much quicker, and ultimately they're more accurate, we're not having a crew out there running their trucks for days on end. We're able to get them in quicker. They're able to be used faster. And then we have some assurances that they're going to be to the standard that we need. We don't have to replace them 2 and 3 times because we don't have the right cross slope or running slope for our ADA ramps or whatever it might be. And so some of those pieces I think are really part of the equation. New technologies, though, are really coming out so fast, and trying to find ways to be, if you work for an agency, to also sort of have that materials testing component to it. I'm still trying to figure that out. So if anybody's got suggestions on how to convince your ops and maintenance folks to let you go try and test something new on a fun project, any good arguments that you've used, I'm looking for those. But that's really, I think at this point, continuing to just be the sort of squeaky wheel within that group and continuing to try and find new ways to approach things, find allies, and just keep talking to folks. I think there's a lot of new technologies that are coming online. We're not all going to see them all at the same time, so trying to find ways to learn what's out there.
I would just add, we like to use the term proceed with professional skepticism. As you have a strategic vision to take on some of this, figure out what your risk-reward trade-off is going to be. How much risk are you going to insert into a project when you're planning versus what you mentioned with the piloting, and what is the pilot level that you are comfortable with and that you are going to represent and you're going to own if it doesn't work, and you can transfer that knowledge to others what didn't work. And then you can also own what does work, and you can transfer that as well.
Yeah, I agree with all your comments, and I would just add that I think for us, it's finding sponsors, project sponsors that are willing to try. And also from a procurement standpoint, I think as an industry, we're starting to look at different delivery models where we're bringing the design and the builder together early, because that will give us more opportunity to say, here's our dream, here's what we wish for, and what can we do with both the builder and the designer in the room together with our sponsor early. Because I do think that when we deliver in the traditional design bid build way, we have already made the decision about what we think is going to work, and inevitably we have lost the opportunity to have that mix of design and build together to figure out what can be possible and maybe to do some prototypes and pilots with us.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then we talk about it, with the innovations and adaptations and the funding side of it, right? And the mechanisms around that. Like, are there any funding strategies or mechanisms available to support these infrastructure projects? I mean, like how are we able with the communities like to access some like the fundings, or you guys as far as like with some of these new initiatives?
Well, there are some, new grants. Like at the federal level, there's some grants for resiliency planning that we're pursuing. And I think at the end of the day, it is finding the right one for what you want to pilot and try, because they all have their kind of narrow scope at times. And we're never quite sure if we're going to be successful at being able to pursue them. And I would say that sometimes with grant funding on the delivery side, then you've got to figure out, well, do you have to buy American, BABA, all these other rules that may or may not give you the space to be able to innovate. So just being careful about saying yes, but then getting your hands kind of tied.
I would just add the importance of the collaboration here that you mentioned, because there are those FEMA grants, there are port security grants, there are other types of grants out there, and there's an entire industry of folks out there whose careers are to connect to those grants. So maybe you don't have to hire that person, but you can collaborate with everybody in this room or your partners at the local, state, federal level and identify what those are so that you can stretch those dollars.
Taking my response in a little bit of a different direction, one way, so we've got some funding that we have at state level that we were able to apply to a trail project that didn't tie our hands to some of the requirements that we might have if it was a federal project, if it was federal dollars that we were using for those projects. So we were able to look at things maybe in a little bit different light. So looking at, kind of setting the stage early, if you're looking at your funding source and sort of looking at some of those requirements, that might help inform whether or not, if you're really looking at a pilot project, whether or not it would be appropriate to sort of fit underneath some of those frameworks. And then I do know in the state of Oregon, we're starting to see more and more of our comprehensive plan documents looking at greenhouse gas emissions, our transportation system specifically. And there are funding sources available at the state level for communities that are updating their comprehensive plans, for example, to go through that exercise. So it may be looking at it in a little bit of different way than sort of the federal level. I do know there are a lot of opportunities at the federal level, but there are some local and state options as well, too.
And I'll just mention that the Clean Air Construction Collaborative that I mentioned is funded through the different agencies via an intergovernmental agreement. So they make contributions based on their annual budgets, and that all goes towards our Clean Air Construction Program coordinator who administers the program and all of the associated software and other services to keep the program running.
Perfect. Great. Last question, long-term vision, right? So how can public agencies balance immediate need with a long-term sustainability goal in their infrastructure planning?
I'll just start by encouraging agencies to set a policy if they don't have one already. The City of Portland has our sustainable procurement policy that establishes the applicability. Yes, it applies to every single city-funded procurement. We have a set of guiding principles and priority focus areas, baseline and emerging best practices, and an outline of roles and responsibilities. So in my short time in this role, just over a year, I've had lots of opportunities to educate folks about the fact that a policy does exist and we all have a part to play in upholding it.
As an agency who's a bit earlier in our process than Portland is right now, I think my current focus is really trying to identify those folks within our procurement process that might be part of such a policy in the future, and then to start thinking about building that network and then trying to work on the actual outcome as a part of that. It's changing hearts and minds, and obviously you've got a lot of folks within an agency that you're trying to make happy when you're thinking about a component of construction, a material that ultimately is going to impact a lot of your transportation system specifically. But I think just starting with that, trying to sort of understand how those roles fit together within your agency, how you might be able to go through that adoption process, and then looking at examples from others around you that have been able to be successful. Doesn't mean you have to necessarily wholesale adopt that approach, but you got to have a place to start and kind of see it how it might unfold within your organization.
I'll just put a plug out for our disaster resilience framework. It's a really short document. I would recommend that if you're approaching this, you get a copy of it and look at, there's one key page that identifies questions you can start asking for that credible information, how you integrate the planning, and what incentives you both can create within your position and you can adopt from others' position through that collaboration to your processes.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. The only thing I might add, maybe pivoting slightly differently, is I think it's both resilient built environment and resilient people. So how we actually create a space within our organizations where people are encouraged to learn and have that culture of curiosity and trial can be challenging because, you know, we get criticized all the time for our failures. And so sometimes it can be really challenging for organizations to be able to lean into that. And then I'm just going to put a plug. I consider it part of resiliency that the Port of Seattle just had a cyber attack a couple months ago, and it has been 2+ months of really challenging, refusing to pay the ransomware. So when I think about resiliency, I think the cybersecurity aspect of what we need to be doing as public agencies is also going to be really important to think about it. We, had our COOP, our continuity of operations around what happens if you have a flood? What happens if you have an earthquake? I don't know that we completely understood, well, what happens if you actually don't have your system up at all? How do you even communicate? So slightly different, but it's been on my mind.
For sure. Well, thank you so very much. Carrie, Ryan, Andrew, Janice, really appreciate your time and your insight on this topic, and carving out some time to kind of discuss with the audience today. I know we're a little bit of time here. If there's anything you guys wanted to add last minute here, I think we kind of touched on most of everything.
I'll just highlight one of those guiding principles from our policy, which is to take that life cycle cost perspective, because oftentimes I come across those perceptions that the more sustainable option is going to be the more expensive option. And sometimes we find that that's not the case. Sometimes it is, but if you calculate that life cycle cost compared to that upfront cost, we see that value over time.
For sure. Well, thank you very much. If the audience would like to extend their any of these conversations, they'll be available in the foyer. So if you could please give a round of hand for the panelists. Thank you so much.